But did he live in the same neighborhood as Tommy Three Fingers Lucchese and Paul Castellano? Is that accurate?
Yeah, and Frank and the mafia didn't get along. He hated the mafia, and they didn't have any respect for him either. And he would torment the Castellano and the Brown family by running his car up at night on the lawn and all that, late at night, and he'd have noisy parties, and he didn't care. Frank was fearless. I mean, that guy was absolutely fearless. He didn't fear anybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime and Entertainment. I got two very special guests. Going to talk a little bit about Frank Matthews. A lot of people are familiar with Frank Lucas, whose story was portrayed by Denzel Washington in the terrific movie American Gangster. But there's another Frank out of New York that's got some North Carolina ties as well. And I brought on two gentlemen that know an awful lot about him. Please welcome Ron Chepesiuk and Dan Pearson. How you doing, fellas?
Thank you for having us.
Fine, thank you, Wade. How are you doing?
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure to have you guys. I guess let's out the rip. How does this book come about? Did you guys know each other prior? What was the kind of the breeding ground to this happening?
Well, I did the book first. I was working on a book called Gangsters of Harlem, and I was researching the history of Harlem and black gangsters in New York. And I was running across Nicky Barnes, Frank Lucas, Goldfinger, and all the other ones. And I ran across Frank Matthews. I didn't know anything about, and I said, "Wow, this is a really interesting guy." I mean, he was really big, 21 states. He operated outside of his neighborhood, which was unusual in those days. And I said, I think I'll include him in the book. And then, so I included him in the book. I have a chapter on him there. And, it's pretty basic information on him. And there's really nothing on him. I mean, well, there was a book that was done on him, Easy Money. That was done, but it was mostly on one of his dealers that he was, and Frank was an ancillary to the story. So I said, yeah, and I just finished Gangsters of Harlem. I was looking for my next book, and I said, why not Frank Matthews? And so I researched it. I went to Durham, where he grew up, and talked with him. I was in New York, talked with a bunch of people that were associated with him. People heard about me. They started contacting me. And the next thing you know, I had a book, and Dan sort of showed up one day. Dan, how did you learn about me in the book? Did you know about the book when you contacted me?
Uh, actually, what was going on, and I, I'm friends. I was friends with a guy named Ralph Natali. Ralph was the boss of the Philadelphia. Ralph was the boss of the Philadelphia family, and he was basically the first mob boss to tell his story in the first person. I mean, Joe Bonanno told his story, but a round way, Ralph told his story and the crimes. And Ralph and I were very good friends. And I said, okay. So I reached out to Ron because I heard about him to inquire if he would be interested in writing the Ralph Natali book. And we went around and we got to know each other. And Sonny Francis was a very good friend of mine. I knew Sonny Francis for many, many years. Yeah. So yeah, okay. John and I were best friends, and we're still friends. We still speak. So that world, I know that world very well, and I'm known in that world. You know, um, so Ron and I became very good friends, and I knew Frank Matthews when I was a teen. Hmm. Good. Yeah, yeah. I'm a Brooklyn guy. I'm a Brooklyn guy. I'm from Brooklyn. So 60s, early 70s. I was a teenager. Ralph, because I knew Sonny. I knew Sonny. I knew Ralph. I knew other bosses. I'm one of those guys that I stood out. And again, John was one of my best friends. So John Franzese, Michael's brother, and I was very close and still am with the family. So with that being said, the more when I found out Ron did the book, I knew he did a book on someone I knew in the first person, and he was a different guy. He was the original Superfly. Other people tried to steal his vibe and whatever. And if you ever seen the movie with the hell's the Fred Williamson, Black Caesar, that's Frank. That's Frank. I mean, so I was a teen. You run errands and you know who's who, and you decipher what's what, and it's exciting. The cars, the this, the that, the other. So that's how I knew him, and he was generous. He was to the point, and I'm just one of the guys that happen to know him, and know guys like Ralph, and Ralph knew him when he came up to Philadelphia from North Carolina, and the Philadelphia Black Mafia and all that type of stuff. So I'm a sponge. I pick things up. I listen. I learn, and you decide who's it safe to be around, who's it not safe to be around. But Ron has his finger on the pulse of black crime. Not people that changed neighborhoods and this, that, and the other. But I see black crime from a perspective of guys like Frank Matthews had high hopes, high dreams. And you're talking about the Hoover time of Hoover. You're talking about the time of Nixon. Yeah, time of just coming out of Johnson and the Civil Rights Bill and all that. Where your wife is washing clothes and being somewhat of a midwife and to white families, and the husband is underemployed if he's not employed. People with dreams, you see the white guy come by with the nice car and the schools and this, that, and the other, and you want it. So I see people like Frank Matthews as, okay, I'm a wolf. You put a steak in front of me and tell a bloody steak in front of me and tell me I can't eat it. I'm going to eat it. I remember him saying, and I still use the phrase, "I will never be another man's prey." So if I have to become a predator, then that's what it is. I saw it. I understand it. The '70s was a different time. The '70s was a different time. I mean, you walk past an abandoned building, you smell something, it's a dead body. Heroin was everywhere, everywhere. But if he didn't sell it, somebody else was going to sell it.
Very true. Very true. Ron, I'm jumping back to you for 1 minute. You mentioned his North Carolina roots. That's something him and Frank Lucas both did have in common, as well as Bumpy Johnson. He was from the Charleston area, which is where I'm actually at.
Right, right.
what was the reason for him relocating from the Carolinas to New York to, I don't know if he immediately hit town and was a player or if he had to work his way up through the ranks, but what was his reasoning for leaving the Carolinas and going to New York?
Well, Frank was always ambitious, right from a very young age, and he always wanted to be a gangster. You know, he was always in trouble. He got arrested for beating up a chicken farmer, and then he went to reform school. And like a lot of African Americans that went north, from the South, uh, legitimately, they went north for jobs. A lot of gangsters went north for opportunity. You take Bumpy Johnson, who went to New York. You take Ike Atkinson, who was born in Goldsboro. Um, he operated in New York. You had Frank Matthews and a whole bunch of other ones, and they all went. So he had the ambition to be a gangster, and he had his eye on the drug trade because it was starting to really mushroom back in the early '60s, and he realized that there wasn't really that much opportunity for him in Durham. He only had like a grade 7 education. He had to drop out. His father died when he was 4. His mother died when he was 4 years old, and he was raised by his aunt. And so he left and he went to Philadelphia. He had a friend there, and he stayed a year there, working as a barber. And for some reason, he was sensibly kicked out of the city. I don't know why. I was never able to identify what happened to him, but he was, the story goes, told to leave Philadelphia, and he ended up in New York. He was working as a barber. He was on the fringes of organized crime. He was working as an enforcer. He worked in the numbers, all that, all with an eye of eventually breaking into the drug trade. And so in those days, the drug trade was run by the mafia, the Italian mafia. And if you were black, you were on the outside, and you did what the mafia said and what they told you to do. But at that time, the drug trade was breaking up. The French Connection, which was the major source of supply with drugs, which misnomer is called the French Connection, but it really operated out of Marseille. That's where the cocaine laboratories were, and it was run by the Italian mafia, and they were getting busted and all that. So that the trade was fragmenting, and that opened up opportunities for black dealers, and so they began to start to run the show. And Frank was trying to break in, and he went to two different families, mafia families, trying to get into the drug trade, whether or not they would sell him dope and all that, and they both turned him down. And it looked like he wasn't going to achieve his ambition. And then he had a friend, a really famous guy named Spanish Raymond Marquez, who was a numbers dealer, and Spanish Raymond connected him with Orlando Gonzalez, who was a Cuban drug dealer, pretty prominent in those days, and Gonzalez and Matthews hit it off, and Gonzalez sold Matthews his first kilo for like $20,000 on that, and that started him. That started him in the drug trade. So he got his foot in. He had an international connection because Gonzalez had to flee because he was wanted on drug charges, and so he fled to Venezuela. And in Venezuela, Gonzalez had a lot of connections with the mafia, not the Italian mafia, but the Corsican mafia. And so Matthews started to go to Venezuela, and he started to line up shipments. And so he had this incredible international route. He was one of the first gangsters in the U.S. to develop an international pipeline to the United States. And he operated for like incredible, like maybe 5 years, and nobody knew who he was. And the reason for that was, frankly, it was racism. They couldn't believe that a black guy could develop a ring that he did, an operation like him. And it wasn't until a cop named Joe Kowalski, who was living in the same apartment building with Matthews, became suspicious with all these people coming to visit Frank at all hours of the night, and he checked out their license plates, and they were suspected dealers coming from the south and from all over and all that. And he finally convinced his superiors that they should check into this guy. And that's how the investigation began for Frank. But he operated for like 4 or 5 years, building one of the biggest networks in the United States without any kind of worry about the cops.
Wow.
What's funny is I actually live around the corner for where Frank lives in Brooklyn right now.
And I don't want to get too far ahead of the story. And you guys making and smarten me up on this at a time, and this may have been later on in the story, but did he live in the same neighborhood as Tommy Three Fingers Lucchese and Paul Castellano? Is that accurate?
Yeah, Three Fingers Brown. Three Fingers Brown, right? Well, Three Fingers Brown was dead. He lived near the family. I actually went to Staten Island. I saw that, and it was really funny because you could look from the house and see Frank's place, and Frank and the mafia didn't get along. He hated the mafia, and they didn't have any respect for him either. And he would torment the Castellano and the Brown family by by running his car up at night on the lawn and all that, late at night, and he'd have noisy parties, and he didn't care. Frank was fearless. I mean, that guy was absolutely fearless. He didn't fear anybody.
And Paul Castellano, for people that may not know, or if you watch his channel, I'm sure you do, but at the time, for a small period of time, until he took a dinner date at Sparks, was the head of the Gambino crime family, which was one of the largest crime families in New York, maybe at that time of all time, or
Yeah.
at least the biggest in that era. So not just a nobody that he's poking fun at and ribbing. And I remember reading that story about how even they, like you said, the cops and a lot of people didn't even know who he was or what he was into, was like, who the hell is this guy here, causing all this stuff, doing all this. Was the how I want to word this, was the nonchalantness to their him not worrying about what they could do, was that a little bit of a payback that they didn't want to give him a shot when he tried to break in? Was it kind of like, F you, I'm doing my own thing? Or he was just like that with anybody that was against him?
Yeah. Well, it was a little bit of his bravado. Plus, also, he was starting to have a cocaine problem himself. He was one of the early guys. He was Scarface before Scarface's time. On that, and so I always thought that he was a little bit reckless, and I think that recklessness came from his growing addiction to cocaine. I think that was a really really big problem for him. But he was fearless. I mean, he didn't care, and he was tough. There's stories about him. People told me stories about him. He was built like a linebacker. You know, uh, if you look down from the waist down, he looked very normal, but from the waist up, he was really built on that. And he was a small guy. He was like his nickname was Pee Wee. But he was really tough. And the thing that gave him away. So later on, when people said, "Oh yeah, I met Frank Matthews," I said, "Well, how did he sound?" They go, "Well, what do you mean how did he sound?" I said, "His voice, well, normal." Well, it wasn't normal. It was a high pitched voice, a very high pitched, girly type voice, which belied his physical presence. I mean, and everybody told that about him. So, yeah, he was an amazing character.
Yeah. Dan, I heard you chuckle a little bit when Ron mentioned the names that kind of put Frank on. Did you know some of those guys?
um, when you talk about Frank, even today, I specialize in crime and I specialize in organized crime. But when you mention Frank Matthews, those guys have a certain reverence for him that he's the one that got away. So it's different. I was a fighter, so he had been around fighters at the time. You have Ali at the time. You have all these different places. And he's got the money. He's got the women. He's got the this. He's got the that. So it shows up. I mean, the way I look at it is this: everybody comes from somewhere. My family came from Orangeburg, South Carolina, and Bennettsville. You know, okay, Marlboro County. So those guys, those people living in Jim Crow. eventually you're gonna, you get hungry, you're gonna do something. So they came north, and they didn't get jobs, they didn't get this, they didn't get that. Again, racism. Then you got the Black Panthers coming up. You got this. The turn of the change, but Vietnam brought in so much drug addicts. The soldiers became customers, and it went from there. So you someone who's ambitious and fearless, how are you going to stop them? How are you going to stop? And you're making so much money, and you're paying the police, you're paying this, you're paying that, you're making money. And again, racism, it made him invisible to a degree because they could not believe that this guy could be doing this, that, and the other. Even if he's in your face, he's flaunting in your face. It didn't matter. It can't be. It just can't be. And he was.
And you've got to be
So, yeah.
making some serious money to operate outside of the control of the mob, because by and large, for a long period of time, it didn't matter what you did, you had to kind of pay tribute to the mob in some way. They even had their hands in the numbers back when the Queen used to run it. They got a piece, and that's a whole nother podcast altogether. But when you can just outright cut them out and do your own thing, and not only that, flaunt, like you said, flaunt what you're doing in front of them, that you got to have some serious capital behind you to be able to do that. And it sounds like he definitely did.
Well, this what was said to me. Excuse me, Ron, for a moment. It was said to me, one of the guys that threatened, had said to Frank, well, a mob guy, it's basic threat. And he said, listen, I make so much money, I can pay your brother to kill you. So what do you say to that? What do you say to that? I mean, they can hate you, they can be envious of you, but did they really want a war with you? Did they really want to go down the street, walking this way, walking that way? What do you say? Touch one of my men, I'll kill every Guinea on Mulberry Street. And he's positive. If you say it in that time and you mean it, it could possibly happen. So even the mob guys, their bravado. If you hurt one of those guys, you kill one of those guys, the others think twice. Remember, they're human too. They get shot up too.
Ron, what were you going to
Yeah.
say, buddy?
Frank was famous for saying telling the Italian mafia that if you touch any of my guys, I'm going to come down Mulberry Street and shoot every wop in sight.
I mean, just that statement.
I mean, that tells you a lot about Frank. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, for a black man to make that statement to Italian mob guys at that point in time in New York, that is balls that clank. I mean, there's just no other way to phrase it, and to by all intents and purposes, meant it. There's a current series. I don't know if any guys ever watched it, but it was called Sons of Anarchy. It centered around a motorcycle.
Oh yeah, I watched it. Yeah.
It was one of my favorite shows. And one of the best seasons in there was when they were dealing with the drug guys out of California, and it was played a character by the name of Damon Pope. I forget the real name of the guy who played him, but he was the one in the wheelchair in the Oz series. He played Damon Pope. And Jax asked him, lead character asked him, how do you stay protected? And he said, there's a bounty on whoever's head that kills me. So if they kill me, they automatically become a dead man because there's a bounty on their head. Now, he actually used that to his advantage because he pinned his murder on a guy that he wanted taken out anyway. So maybe not a foolproof plan, but in the sense of it, it's kind of like what Matthew said. You kill me, I'll have all my guys come and wipe out the whole block. One down, but I'm wiping out a whole block or half a family. So it makes sense. And that's impressive to have that kind of stroke in those days. I do want to dive into a little bit. Lucas was famous for what they referred to as the coffin connection. You said he had kind of a plot back to how he got the drugs. Was there any specific way of how he got the drugs back into the States?
Well, you're talking about Lucas. What you're really talking about is Sergeant Smack's story, because Lucas stole Ike Atkinson's story, and it's in my book, Sergeant Smack. Yeah, yeah, on that then. And the American Gangster. If you never didn't know anything about Lucas, you'd think the movie was really great, and it was, but it was total fabrication, and especially the cadaver connection. I spent 8,000 words in my book, Sergeant Smack, uh, refuting it. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see why it was impossible to have such a connection. But it grew. It grew. I mean, there were when I was researching the book on Sergeant Smack with Ike Atkinson. There was like 10,000 entries on the internet, and they're all saying that Lucas did this incredible connection where he used the cadavers and the coffins of American soldiers to ship drugs back on that. And one of the AP reporters approached me and wanted to do a story just when the movie came out in 2007. And he was doing a story on that. And he said, what about this cadaver? And I said, it's total fabrication. So he started to argue with me. He said that. And I said, look, I have sources in Bangkok, in Asia, and in North Carolina. You could talk to them and they'll tell you that what I'm trying to tell you. And he did on that. And he came back to me and he said, yeah, he says, I think you're right. The story was, and he did this story where he questioned Lucas's claim about the cadaver connection. And at that time, there was talk about an Oscar nomination for American Gangster and all that. And I really think I had something to do with him not getting that nomination, because you started to see stories appearing, and people started to question, Lucas, his story, and I could tell you how that story originated. It began with an article in New York Magazine by Mark Jacobson in 2000. Um, if you want to hear, I'll tell you. Yeah, well, what happened was Mark Jacobson was looking for a good story. He heard about Lucas being a big gangster back in the late 60s, early 70s. And so he arranged an interview with him. And Lucas was on welfare at that time. He was barely living. And he interviewed Lucas. And when you read that article, you could see what Lucas was doing. He was playing the reporter. He was telling him stories about that got more fantastical and more fantastical as they went along. And he asked him about the cadaver connection, and he said, "Oh yeah, I did that." And he explained how he did it and all that. And that would have been it. It would have been an article. It would have died about 3 months later after it was published, and nobody would have thought anything about it. But two big shots in Hollywood read that story, and they said, "Wow, what a story! This would make a great movie." So here you have Lucas telling the story. He was stuck with it. He was stuck with it, and it's like the guy with every time he told a lie, his nose would grow, and that's the same thing that would happen with Lucas. Every time he told his story, it got more preposterous on that, and so that's the background on Lucas and the cadaver connection.
So, what was the way that Frank Matthews was able to get his? Did he have any sort of specialized connection, or was it just?
Well, he had a Venezuelan connection. He had a source that was gold. I mean, all the the heroin, and he had the Corson connection, and he had the pipeline. Yeah, and yeah, and these really bright, uh, industrious gangsters like Lucas and not Lucas, but well, maybe even Lucas too, but especially Atkinson and Matthews. And I've talked with DA agents about that. They said they could have ran any multinational in the world if they had the opportunity to be legitimate, because what they're doing. They have a criminal organization, but it's a multinational, and that's what Frank was operating. He was operating a multinational from Venezuela on that, and he was able to expand. He was in 21 states. Um, he had ambitions about not staying in the drug trade. He had 3 kids that were with him and Barbara Hinton, his common law wife. He had great hopes for them. He was sending them to private school. He wanted them to be really successful. Um, the DA told me that he had bought land near Atlanta, and he said that if the government never confiscated that land, and Matthews was able to stay out of jail, he would have been a billionaire today, because it was part of the land where the major interstate went through on that. Yeah, on that. And but the government, so he had incredible business instincts. you know, and it takes, you know, you're a gangster, but you're running an operation in 21 states, you know, under the eyes of the law. You know how difficult that is.
Oh, and
You
think
know,
about too, just the times like nowadays that takes work with computers and internet and cell phones and emails and
right?
everything. Back then they didn't have all that shit. They were
That's
doing
right.
they were
That's right.
doing it, old school.
Right. Right. To pay telephones, you know, yeah, 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 to make their calls. No cell phones. Yeah, yeah. It was really good on that then, and yeah. So he was, you know, and you talked about how much money he made. Well, the DA, one of the other reports had him in 1971, I believe, it was like $10 million he made, which doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but that was back in the early 70s. You know, yeah, probably. Yeah, right. It'd be close to 80 million today on that. Then.
When a loaf of bread was a quarter, you can imagine.
Right.
You living good. Dan, any stories of Frank from the streets? Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
some of these guys are a little bit when they get in that position of hierarchy, some get hands off, some get more hands on. What was Frank's position in the street? Did he, mind getting out there and being in the thick of things?
From what I understood, from what I observed, you thought twice. Thought twice. I mean, these guys came up from the South. These, you know, here in New York, we go to a supermarket and buy a chicken. They're killing chickens. you know, things we take for granted. All the things we take for granted. Listen, Pee Wee Kirkland, who's a good friend of mine, said to me, we're talking about Frank. He said Frank was bigger than the ten biggest guys in Harlem. You put them together, they didn't measure up to Frank. And I was like, oh, okay. But the thing is, those guys were very dangerous. These are country boys. They're used to having blood on their hands. City guys is much different.
It's no
These guys,
coincidence. A lot of these guys have Carolina roots, like we've mentioned, the Bumpy Johnsons, the Frank Matthews, the Frank Lucas. And you said, was Ike a North Carolina guy as well?
Yeah,
yeah.
Goldsboro. Goldsboro.
You notice they kill a pig. And when do city guys get to do any of that and then put their hand in the animal's stomach? So it's no different than killing a man for them. So no, he wasn't the guy to fool around with.
What was like any like fear stories of, oh, I heard he did this to this guy, or I heard this happened to this guy for doing this type stories?
I mean, look, there's always going to be a story. What is the story true or not? You don't know. You learn, as I learned as a young man, as a teenager, not to repeat things. Not to repeat things. I mean, you had detectives, narcotics cops walking around looking like junkies, and you say something about somebody else that gets back in the precinct, you heard it came from this guy, then you wind up being the body. So I learned to listen and keep my mouth shut. Otherwise, you open your mouth, you may not get a chance to shut it again. It's a different time, man. I mean, these are people that come to your house. To your house. This, yeah, none. I mean, think about it. You had guys with straight razors. You're a Southern guy. You heard about the straight razors. And how many guys you see with sliced faces? This, that, and the other. It was a different time. And the country boys did what? They carried guns. They used to shooting. So the city guys looked at them in a certain way until something happened. And remember, the so-called city guys have Southern roots.
Yeah, it's interesting about Frank Matthews. I had a hard time finding stories of violence involving him. You know, whether he killed anybody. There's really nothing in my book says that he ever killed anybody. I met one guy in Colombia that claimed that one of his uh, friends was killed by Frank over some kind of drug deal, but I was never able to verify that story on that. But how do you explain that? I don't know. It's just really strange, because Frank Lucas and the Country Boys were really violent, and Nicky Barnes was involved with violence. Not so much Pee Wee Kirkland, but on that. But uh, yeah, he was able to operate mostly with his intelligence, and his charisma.
And that
Word.
speaks volumes of what you can do. When you can operate without fear, but yet people
Yeah,
still fear you, that's
yeah,
another level.
That is what's called why take the chance? Why take the chance? Because guess what? If Frank is upset with you and you got all these guys making their living with him and they want to look good, they may do it. And it's still not attributed to you, but people do disappear. People did wind up in a lot of abandoned buildings. New York was a bunch of abandoned buildings, man. Lots, cars. So, the guy who doesn't have to do it doesn't have to do it. That's real fear.
Yeah. It's like the old saying from the movie A Bronx Tale, is it better to be loved or feared? Fear lasts longer than love. And that's
yeah,
that's true. That's a very true statement. And it
yeah,
still holds true to this day. So a lot of guys, if you can operate on fear and not have to use physical violence, that's even more to your benefit because you don't have the law
yeah,
enforcement breathing down your neck. You can get away with a lot as long as you're not dropping bodies in the street. When you start
yeah,
doing that, then the law enforcement has to get involved. And it's that old saying, if you're on the mattresses, you're not earning. So you're able to operate a little bit more in open when you don't have to resort to the violence. I do have a question. So he reigned for quite a while, and from what I understood and some things that I read, he did get busted, but they didn't know that he was at the level he was at. And I want to say maybe it was a different area. Is that accurate? How did the downturn?
Oh, he got busted. Like I said, when they finally got onto Frank, they eventually put wires on him. They're able to trace him, and they're able to build a case against him. And he was arrested on his way to the Super Bowl. Yeah, you remember when Miami was undefeated? They beat Washington 14-7. The reason I know that I was a big Miami Dolphin fan back then, and uh, and he was arrested on his way to the Super Bowl and brought back. He was arraigned in Las Vegas, and his bail was the biggest ever up to that point, $5 million, and it was reduced to 2.5 million, and then finally the judge and the prosecutor and detectives investigating went nuts when they reduced it to 350,000 because that was just pocket change for Frank on that. So he got off. So he got a $350,000 bill when they shipped him back to New York, and he was able to get off. He was able to get out on bail, and rumors were he was still operating as a gangster then, still selling and all that sort of stuff. And pardon me. No, no, he didn't have anything. He didn't have anything on him on that then. Um, but Frank knew that they were on the wire, but he didn't care. I mean, they would try code, with some of his homeboys, that he had working for him, and they would screw it up. The thing and all that, and they'd argue on the phone about it, and he was just fearless. And I don't know if that was natural or that was part of the cocaine problem that he had on that. And then he fled July 2nd, 1973. He went to court um, um, in um, in New York, in Manhattan, and walked out and disappeared. And allegedly with a young mistress named Cheryl Brown. She was about 24 years old, real beautiful. All the detectives just oohed and awed about her on that when they described and talked about her, and they both disappeared. And that's where the story gets really interesting.
Right, and that's
Right.
that's the odd part about this is everything we've talked about. Now it start the
Yeah,
plot
I mean,
thickens
right
in
now,
this thing.
right now, there's enough there for one guy, for a story, right? And he gets arrested and all that. But the actual, and this is the second part of my book where I talk about the investigation of trying to get him, and he disappeared completely. And they talk about Jimmy Hoffa, being a great case. Hoffa's case is nothing compared to this. There's never been anything found about Matthews. No photographs, no fingerprints, no snitches.
Let me ask you a question, Ron. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. I got a little brain fog. What was the name of the prosecutor again? Raymond Deary, right? Do you wait? Do you know who Raymond Deary is? Raymond Deary is the became a judge who put Gotti in prison. He became the judge who was the special prosecutor in the Donald Trump case in Florida. He was the judge in the Donald Trump case. That's yeah. Well, tell them the story about how Deary and Matthews was in the bathroom.
Oh yeah, they were in the yeah, they were in the bathroom, and uh, Frank was in there, and he's saying, "Hello, Mr. Derry, how are you doing today?" He was very nonchalant, and uh, what happened was Derry actually told him how he was going to prosecute him, and Frank realized that if he was prosecuted that way and he was convicted, he wasn't getting out. He was going to go away forever on that then, and so he nonchalantly walked out of the bathroom, and not soon after that, he disappeared. He walked out and he disappeared, and there's a story about one of the detectives chasing him in the street and losing him in traffic and all that. Some of the detectives questioned whether that was true or not. They thought it was BS on that. But, you know, uh, there was two DEA agents. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, yeah. It was the biggest DEA investigation in history. They had like six DEA agents assigned to the case. The two detectives that or DEA agents that I interviewed were assigned to him for a year, and all they did was try to find him.
But I mean, when you look at it, I'm sorry, Ron. Excuse me. When you look at it, and right, and the CIA, you're dealing with the CIA, you're dealing with the U.S. Marshals, you're dealing with federal agents, you're dealing with NYPD, and the guy's gone. And you're dealing with the mafia, and the guy is gone. Poof. Where is he? Where is he?
Well, yeah, and there was a story written by a prominent guy a couple years ago, and it's BS. They excluded the mafia very early in the investigation. I talked with them about that, and they said, yeah, the mafia were happy to see him go because he was such a pain in the ass, with them. So that's not true.
Was there
But there-
was that accurate that he was trailed to a bank in North Carolina?
Yeah, yeah, right, right. Well, I interviewed one of the IRS agents that interviewed him, and they did, but they got there too late for that. Yeah, right on that. And he went back. The bond was paid by a guy named Sales in Durham. He owned an auto shop, and he actually paid him off. He went back to Durham and paid off. So we know he was still alive back then on that. I say he's still alive because I have my own theory about what happened to Frank
Well,
on
and
that.
I'm very curious about that theory because, in my opinion, I think this is one of the reasons why Frank does not get a lot of press, right? Because you want to put a bow on it in some way or fashion. Okay, we got him. The DEA got him. Law enforcement did their job. The mob got him. His own brother turned on him. His own people got rid of him. You want to be able to wrap this up. The fact that this guy was able to rise to the level of what he did, bringing in the amount of product that he did, making the amount of money, flaunting his nose at the Italians, which essentially ran a lot of the organized crime in New York. And you can't really tell me what happened to him. It's like it's the biggest stain on their shirt you can ever imagine. So I think personally, that's why he doesn't have the notoriety to some people that maybe don't know this history as well as others, as opposed to someone like Frank Lewis. But I'm very curious of your opinion of what happened.
But what happened was they reopened the investigation. They went there for a long period of time, and they couldn't find anything, so they sort of slowed down. Then they reopened. They decided to re-interview all the people that went to trial because after Frank disappeared, they indicted the remaining members of his group. There was about 16 members of that group, and they brought him to trial a couple years later. So they interviewed most of the guys that were still living, not one of them talked about Frank. Not one of them would say anything about Frank. That's why I say there have been no snitches. There's people
But
that claim that they know what happened to Matthews, but they're full of crap.
so
On
I
that. And but these guys, didn't talk. They wouldn't talk, and they really frustrated. I was talking to the marshal that investigated Frank at that time, and he said you're just frustrated on that. They couldn't understand why they couldn't get any information out of it, and he's been reported in 50 countries in that. Um, I was with Ike Atkinson at his house, right? And I was sitting there, and he goes, "This guy wants to talk to you." And I said, "Who's that?" He goes, "He says he knows Frank Matthews." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." He says, and I said, "Well, where is Frank?" And he said, "This guy says he's in Chicago." And I laughed. I said, "Frank hated cold weather." I said, he wanted to go to Venezuela. That's where he wanted to live. He wrote this essay when he was a young kid saying he wanted to go to Venezuela, which ironically he ended up doing. But so I said, okay. So he said, "Do you want to talk to him?" I said, okay. So I ended up on the phone with this guy. And, or no, excuse me. What happened was I said, okay, I want to talk to him. So he went back to the guy, and the guy came back, and I came back, and he said, well, he can't. He said, Frank doesn't want to talk to you right now on that. Then, and I said, okay, I know I didn't say anything about it. Then he came back a little later, and he said the guy said that Frank's ready to talk to you on that. And then something happened. I never did eventually talk to this guy, but there were all kinds of stories like that I ran
right.
across. Frank was dressed as a woman. He came back to Durham. People swore that had happened. One guy said he went to the party, and he heard Frank voice behind him, and he looked around, and it was Frank, but he was plastic surgery. And I said, "Well, how did his voice sound?" He goes, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, what did it sound? Normal? What?" He goes, "Yeah, it was normal." I knew the guy was BSing me because I told you about his voice, right? He had a high pitched voice, very distinctive high pitched voice on that. And so this went on. You got the CIA involved, in this story, which is amazing. William Callahan, the prosecutor, told me that when they did the indictment on the gang, they had the Venezuelan connection because what led to the final arrest was this big drug deal, $100 million drug deal that Frank screwed up because he was on the phone blabbing away, and they picked it up and they busted the deal, and they arrested 18 Corsicans in Venezuela as part of this, and that was going to be part of the indictment. They're going to have a Venezuelan part and a U.S. part, and the CIA came in and said you have to cut off the Venezuelan part, and Bill Callahan said, "What for?" He said, "Because we said so. We're the federal government." And so we don't know why they did that. I think politics were involved. Castro had taken power in 59, and the CIA was using Venezuela as a listening post, to monitor Cuba, and they didn't want publicity that would sort of screw up their operation on that. But yeah, I mean, the story gets weirder and weirder uh, when you investigate it, and but nothing ever shows up. Nothing ever shows up. I mean, nothing concrete that you could say, yeah, here's a lead. This will lead to something.
You look like
Well,
you're jumping at the
yeah, because I'm laughing a little bit because of all the different stories. So I have a friend of mine who was a very high-ranking U.S. Marshal, and he was after Frank for a long time. He said when the American Gangster came out, there was a phone call to a barber shop in Harlem. There was a bunch of street guys went there, older street guys went there, and they were taping, had a wiretap on it. And he said to me, it was Frank on the phone. And he said, that's why these guys got together to speak to him. And that's Frank supposedly said the movie is bullshit, the this, that, and the other, whatever the case may be. But this came from a U.S. Marshal, a very high ranking U.S. Marshal. The thing is, we don't know. It's all conjecture. He could be molding somewhere, or he could be somewhere. You just don't know. We just don't know. But the one thing we do know is sort of like the movie Catch Me If You Can. meets American Gangster, the original American Gangster, and that's what's exciting. So as we're putting this film together, we learn a lot more, and it's based on Ron's book and some of the interviews of people that I knew, or other people knew, and again, like I said, I'm actually around the corner from where he lived. So we see it as very exciting. But the bottom line is, we all come from somewhere, and a person of a certain intellect with an ambition does not want to work for $1.50 an hour.
And you made a good point earlier, Ron, when you talked about these guys that run these organizations, whether it be the mob or Frank Lucas or Frank Matthews, they have a special kind of skill. And I interviewed a guy who was a prolific marijuana smuggler, and he wound up going to prison. And he got out, and his wife was like, "Look, you got to find a job." And he's like, "Look, all I've ever did is smuggle marijuana. Like, I can't put that on a resume." And she said, "What do you mean you can't put it on a resume?" He said, "Well, they're not going to hire me." He said, "Well, you don't say what you did exactly." He said,
Yeah.
"You run a transportation network. You had 50 people working under you. You
There
ran
you go.
logistics. You organize drop points for loads. You organize, all kinds of stuff. You handle finances. You ran a multi-billion-dollar business. You don't have to give them every damn thing." And he said, I listed that, and he said I got more calls in a week than I could ever imagine. When he just kept out the fact that it was weed that he done all this stuff
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
goes to the point, like you said, you got to have a right business mind and business acumen to be able to pull this off, especially back in those days.
Yeah.
And,
People talk about Matthews being in the present tense, but I like talking about the past. I think he's dead. Yeah, he'd be 81 years old this year. He'd be 82 next year, and he had a bad heart. He had a weak heart. In fact, there's a story. One of the D agents told me that they went to Houston to the big medical center down there because rumor was that Frank was going there for a heart transplant. On that, and they thought it was a ridiculous story, but they had to go check it out. And one of his women told that story, and told him that story, and insisted that it was true. And anyways, they went down there, didn't find anything on that sort of stuff. On
well,
that,
that's why people
but
want.
but I would think he. I mean, the thing is, he's in my opinion, he's dead. I hate to say that because it takes the mystery out of the story, but
Stranger
uh,
things have happened.
yeah, because either of his health or he was killed because he left with $20 million, $20 million, which is about $90 million in today's money. Uh, they don't know if he left the country. They traced him to an airport or an airplane outside of in somewhere in Texas near a small town. They don't know whether that plane went into the U.S. or whether it left the the country on that sort of thing. And but if he left the country, he's out of his element. He's out. He's in Venezuela where you have these Corsicans that are pissed off at him because he screwed up this drug deal, and a lot of their men went to jail. He's got $20 million. Yeah, you got 20. I mean, and he's with a girl, and he's got no backup. I mean, so what do you think? I mean, he's going to go anywhere,
Again,
and
stranger things have
it's like a
happened.
jungle. He's like a jungle. He's in a jungle with wild animals, and he's unharmed. He's unarmed.
I can't subscribe to the fact that he stayed in the United States at any way in any way, just because I think it would have been too difficult to not make your presence known.
Yeah.
My opinion. I
Well,
didn't know the man, but I mean, it's hard for
if
people like that to have that level of power and respect to just say, "Okay, here's 10 million. We don't ever want to hear from you again. Don't
right,
make a fucking peep."
right. If you had talked to these DEA agents and marshals that I talked to, it wasn't because I'm not trying. I remember Mike Busy sitting there and he's saying, after 10 years, all I had was a pile of records. That's all I had. He said, I spent 10 years of life trying to track this guy. And he said, I have absolutely nothing. I was back to the beginning of the case when I ended it. That's what he told me, on that then, which is quite amazing. I mean, because, the guy, I mean, they did everything. They had like I said, the biggest investigation in DA history. They put a $25,000 reward on him. That was the first reward that they put on any criminal since John Dillinger. You remember back in the 30s, he was a big gangster back then on that, and they spent millions of dollars on investigating him.
The,
Um,
the wild thing is that if he showed up in a precinct today and said,
they
"Hey,
let him go.
thank you,"
They let. In fact, I asked that question.
there's no evidence,
Yeah, yeah. You know
no
the
witnesses.
investigation. Yeah, right. The investigate. Well, there's no records. I didn't have any. I went to look for the records of the trial. Right, that trial. Remember I mentioned 18 in 1977. They disappeared. There's absolutely no records of the trial. So how are they going to have, what are they going to do for background on that sort of stuff? And Cheryl Brown, she was, she's free. I mean, all they had was a material arrest warrant. She was a material witness to him, which meant that they didn't want to talk to her. They weren't going to arrest her, and so she disappeared. And and I talked to
Never,
the
never a
the
peep,
investigators, and they said she was really close with her parents. The
never a
Browns. They were
peep.
they were middle class teachers from the Bronx, and they ended up in Florida, retired, and they had a wire on their house for 5 years. 5 years they had a wire on their house, and not one call, not one call from her, and which is really weird. I mean, you know, yeah, yeah, 5 years they try to do it. Like I said, they did everything to do it, and it's still an open investigation. And but uh, if I think he's dead. He's 80, he'd be 81 years old. And I went down there and I talked to a bunch of his homeboys, people that were in social with him, and most of them are dead now. They all died in their 60s and 70s. They all lived hard lives. They lived hard. Drank hard, smoked hard, and they all died young. So why do you think Frank's going to live to 81 with a bad heart?
Stranger things have happened.
I think it's hands down definitely one of the more interesting, fascinating cases in all of criminal history. Period.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Just because we don't have an answer for it,
Right.
there's a lot of things it could be, a lot of things that we're hypothesizing, but we don't know for sure. And just the fact that he was able to do what he did,
At such a young age.
yeah, at a
At
young
Yeah.
such
age,
a
that's
Yeah,
young,
yeah. He
young
was
age.
29 he was 29 years old when he fled. He wasn't even 30.
wow. Some people
Think
don't even
about
get in the game to that age of time. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This is fascinating. Now you mentioned something about a movie. Is this a project you guys are putting together?
it's in development right now as a feature, and I can talk. I can say but so much. My agent will chop my head off if I go too far. But I'm happy to Ron asked me to come on. It's Ron's project. It's based on his book, and it's going to be very interesting. It's more than like it'll be shot in 2024. No, it'll be shot in 2026. And probably be out 2027.
Okay. It's very interesting, this whole thing. It's just one of them stories that I think enough people don't know about it. That's what upsets
Yeah.
me when you get on the subject of, of course, Nicky Barnes' names comes up and Frank Lucas because of American Gangster. Everybody's seen the movie, and it was a great movie, as we stated earlier.
Yeah.
Denzel probably should have won an Oscar for it. He was great. Russell Crowe was great, but when you say that name, and then I would immediately follow it up with, have you ever heard of Frank Matthews? Who's that? He wasn't no Frank. Man, you just
You know who name checked Frank Matthews? Listen to watch The Wire, watch certain movies. They name check him. Watch certain TV shows. They name check him. They may not say Frank. They'll say Pee Wee or this one, the biggest one ever done it, and he's disappeared. Where is he? Oh, Frank's over there. Oh, Frank's over there. Oh, Frank's over there. You don't know, and that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it. So it's all conjecture, and we'll find out when we find out.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you gentlemen doing all the legwork in this. Where's the book you guys do have out, Black Caesar? Where can we find that at?
Amazon, bookstores,
Barnes
Barnes
and
and Noble.
Noble.
You're right on that then. And they could check it out. It's still hot. I mean, the subject itself, on that then. And
That's why it's important for channels like mine and John Livia's.
yeah,
Shout out to Serious and Silliness and anybody that covers this type of content to make sure these stories are known because they're highly interesting and a little bit more factual based. We all know Hollywood's going to dramatize certain things, so
Well, yeah, that's what it's going to be, some of it, but we're going to try and keep it closer to the book, closer to the stories that we know at hand. My company is Dan for Entertainment, and my agent, this and the other. The right people are being involved. We're going to do this justice.
and Ron, before we get out of here, I understand you just had a doc drop on was Amazon Prime.
yeah. There's a doc that came out, another drug trafficker that's just as amazing as Frank is. Jesus Ruiz and how he was a Colombian drug trafficker that became the biggest cocaine dealer in British history, and I did a book on him. He contacted me, and we worked out a deal. And did the book on him. It's turned into a documentary that appears on Discovery Plus, HBO Max, and then Apple TV and Hulu now on that. So you can check any of those channels. It's called the Bus Driver, Britain's Cocaine King on that, and you can check it out. And Frank, and the book, by the way, Dan also has the option on that.
Okay, nice. So
Yeah.
we're going to put links to all that in the show notes for people to go check it out. Go check it out, buy the book, check out the doc you just got out on all those platforms. I think I said Amazon Prime, but actually I was watching on my Amazon Fire Stick, but I watched it on HBO Max. So go check out that. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming
It's
on.
a pleasure.
And Dan, I go to New York quite a bit, so let's
Thank you for
link
your
up.
time. Hey, come on, man. Just holler at me and let's go get some good Italian food.
That's what I'm talking about, brother.
All
Appreciate
right,
you
man.
guys stopping by. Ladies
All
and
right.
gentlemen, that'll do it for this episode of Crime and Entertainment. We'll see you next week.